She's just coming from the airport, from over the big pond. So please come up to the stage. Kirsten, she's the CEO of the EIT KIC, Climate KIC. She PhD in cultural history. What can I say? Her career started academic, consulting, banking, insurance, strategy design, innovation, leadership across 3 continents. I mean, it's quite impressive. Pioneering the thinking in the transformation of businesses and industry models through innovation. So yeah, we want to welcome you, and I hope you can give us an insight what it means to run a KIC. To run the EIT Climate KIC, what does it mean, and how we can maybe you can show us somehow how we can work together and build a better future. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to give you many insights into how to run a KIC. That's a living experience and a learning in progress, but I can certainly make some reflections on, now can we go to, okay, so let's start there. Yeah, so I'm going to make some reflections on what I noticed was the title for the session, which struck me as absolutely perfect for what I can bring to you, but it is a slightly different perspective. So I'm bringing a perspective as somebody who is indeed running an organization within the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, whose core purpose is to address climate. And in our particular case, it's a focus on systemic approaches to addressing climate and systemic approaches to innovation, entrepreneurship, education to address climate. And it's not just mitigation, it's also adaptation. And what we do particularly is to work in the areas where our existing systems are extremely stuck and very broken, where there are extremely difficult trade-offs, complicated negotiations, deep vested interests, and a failure, market failures constantly, and a failure to comprehend what would it take to really transform the way in which we live, our design for life. So our focus is on that. And in the work that I do, and we are doing for the last, we are now nearly at the end of our particular founding mandate, so we're in a moment and a stage of major transformation and metamorphosis. If I speak to you about that, I'm also speaking to you about one of the things that we most desperately need as an organization, which is a partnership with culture and creative industries. But what I'm not going to talk to you about is decarbonizing creative industries, even though these are some of the most polluting and damaging industries in the world, because I know that that is, and that will be in the remit of what you are doing, and it will be part of the partnership between us. What I really want to speak to you about is the role of culture and creative industries in the context of climate emergency and in the context of Europe. What is happening in Europe at the moment? And of course, just a reminder, we are all in the business of innovation, but as an innovation organization, my job, as far as I'm concerned, is to push the boundaries as far as possible of what is possible. And to keep doing that so that what we can arrive at is fundamentally transformative and regenerative and self-defining and unprecedented. So sometimes I need to remind myself and everyone that works in Climate KIC, our job is to go further than anybody believes it's possible to go. That's what we're paid to do. And it's an important thing because sometimes you can forget. So, just one important thing, you mentioned it briefly. Yes, I am here as a cultural historian. My background is in Italian, medieval and Renaissance cities, in the way in which they were built, and I will bring a little glimpse from that because, interestingly, I find it more and more relevant to the work that we're doing and to some of the choices that we face. So, let me start with choices. We are in a moment, we are entering, probably we entered it some time ago, but we begin to understand that we are entering a moment as a planet, as a civilization, as a species, of choice between life and no life. We do have choices. It rests in our hands. We can choose to build an ecological civilization, as the Chinese call it, together, or we can choose the future which I would describe as our default future, what we are currently on track for, and we can accept the consequences. As a small reminder from somebody working in the field of climate, we are on track for this. We are not on track for 1.5 degrees. We're on track for 2 degrees of global warming by 2050. And we have just lost, over summer, the Greenland ice sheet. At least the science is suggesting to us that we really have, that's it. It's not reforming sufficiently to hold over winter. The Greenland ice sheet is 6 meters of sea level rise. That means we lose Indonesia and we lose Vietnam by the middle of the century. These are the biggest rice-producing countries in the world. Just to put into perspective the scale and the speed, we have totally underestimated and misunderstood the implications of non-linear change. We've told ourselves that in academic terms, but its realities are not academic. And we keep talking about climate, and very often people say to me, but you haven't talked about biodiversity. For me, it's the same thing. They are deeply connected. Yes, we have a major crisis in collapse of environments and diversity of species, and that is so great a part of the problem that we are also not completely understanding it. It touches everybody. This is a picture of, this is actually one of the maps that came out of thinking with the UN some time ago on what happens when we don't pull off transformation of the human design for life, and what the backup plan is. And it is talking about a global food commons in the few areas in the world that are still arable land, massive renewable energy grids over most of the areas of the world that are not livable. And one of the things that was posited as a major risk at the time when this work was done a couple of decades ago was the risk that Russia would build walls. And now look what we are in. So, it's not a planetary problem, it's a human problem. And that is why really I think it's so important for us to be talking today about the context of what culture and creative industries can do in a climate emergency, climate context. Because this is about us. We have choices. We are makers of our own future. And it's very, very much, I had a particularly chilling conversation over summer. I was running a series of conversations about sense-making to do with the future, the present, what we think is happening around us. And a general who is responsible for the military alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, just very matter-of-fact said to me, look, I mean, as we understand it, it's about getting from 10 billion people to 3 billion people and how to make that acceptable. We're already past the tipping points. And I said, is that your official position? And he said, well, more or less. I mean, that's where we're at. So now we're planning for that. That's 7 billion people being written off. So my question is, how do we make it different? What is possible? And this, I think, is one of the most important thing in the IPCC report, is the idea of unintended consequences, of the consequences of action and not action, of thinking and acting systemically, and the way in which adaptation and mitigation are really woven in together. From my perspective, it defines a large part of the purpose of why we do what we do as an innovation organization in European and European contexts, which means it's really about radical systemic transformation of human society, of human civilization, and of human identity. And you know, crisis is useful. Crisis builds creativity. It releases, encourages, enables creativity, and that's exactly why I am here today, to participate in what you are here to talk about. And in Europe, we have a very, very unusual context. I've literally just come back this morning from New York, from the Climate Week. And what is remarkable when you're in the US, listening to multi-billion-dollar bills being passed on climate change, is that you do not have this, an unusual structural momentum of aligned, nested legislations and a very strong directional signal to say all of these aspects of what we do need to align in a particular direction. I have a bone to pick on the fact that it's green and digital. As far as I'm concerned, digital needs to be in service of green. There's just not an equivalency between them. But I do have a sense that what is happening here is a window of opportunity that is quite extraordinary for all that we complain about, the politics, the bureaucracy, the distributions, the slowness, the mire and murk of dealing with public funding in a European context, here we have a window of action. And it's the window that I would really suggest we design for deliberately. And I want to speak to you as an organization that is leading one of these missions. Putting to one side the not terribly helpful analogy of moonshots and moving fast to the idea of how do you collectivize will in markets, in businesses, in small and medium enterprises, in artists, in makers, in cities and governments. Climate Kick is leading the Net Zero Cities program, which is the pilot of the city mission, and is setting up the framework for the full implementation of the city mission that starts later this year. What that means is 112 European cities agreeing with a formal contracting process to become fully net zero, no offsets, by 2030. That's 12% of Europe's population. It represents 0.7 gigatons of emissions avoided by 2030 if we just work on scope 1 and 2. It represents an extraordinary act of belief and faith in an unknown, uncharted, and currently impossible future. This is Madrid, Rome, Paris, Milan. These are not cities that know how to decarbonize by 2030. Nobody knows how to decarbonize by 2030. So this is going to require acts of imagination, of creativity, of cultural transformation that are completely unprecedented. And that's why I think it matters. And then you have this. You have the uniquely European edition of, and it needs to be affordable. It needs to have a social contract within it. It needs to be accessible, and it needs to be beautiful. Because if we actually wake up in the morning and aspire to live differently, then maybe we will start to make those different choices over and over and over again. And again, I find this unique in its messiness and at the same time such a window, such a framework of opportunity to be seized. So let me come back to what's the relationship between building this and culture and creative industries, and this critical triangulation around the nature and the shape and the design and the intentionality of what we're doing. That it is not incremental, that it is structural, and that it is transformative. For me, there are a few things that I wanted to just quickly unpack and talk to. And here I am speaking as a client. I'm speaking as an organization leading a process with 112 cities. Actually, also, we are going to be working with regions on the mission from adaptation, leading the project that is 150 regions signing up to resilience by 2030. So there's a big constituency.
Can you talk to the microphone, please?
That's a big, you can hear? Can you hear me, or it's a problem of recording?
No, it's also for the online audience.
Okay, of course. Okay, so let me speak to a few things that I would really like to bring out in terms of partnerships that are between systems, between organizations, across European cities and regions, and between communities. And they really have to do with the question of what can culture and creative industries bring to a problem of mobilizing this order of transformative change. And again, let me just really importantly put the emphasis on there is a world of transformation of industries itself. Fashion, textiles, gaming. The internet is the fourth biggest emitter in the world. So there's a lot of work to be done on how do you address the carbon footprint of creative industries in its own right. But these are the things that I would really bring out from the perspective of the work that we are doing and the context of what is happening in Europe. Mindsets. If there is one thing we desperately, desperately need, it is to change our capacity to think. And I want to just bring forward Italo Calvino and the notion of creating the conditions for thinking differently, for taking different mindsets into the world, the political and social scaffolding for that. Because there's something captured here about the states of mind that we need for a complex, adaptive future, adapting to a world that is physically changing and that is socially changing in very dramatic and unpredicted ways, but also adapting to a context that is asking us to make ourselves different on a daily basis. Identity. We are going to have to get rid of, abandon, move beyond Genesis 1.26. We have a problem of our sense of self. We continue to rescribe our relationship to others, especially to inanimate, non-human others, as something that has power of control, power of choice, power of shaping and making. And we forget that we are totally interwoven and interdependent. We are not designing for and with nature. And that really needs to be such an essential part of the way in which we go forward. And that's a question of design. Design choice, design principles, and ultimately sense of self. And for identity, there is only one place in which humans have ever shaped identity. It is through story, narrative, art making. We need to reshape ourselves very fast. And it's a question of timing and of context and of inherent properties. The DNA of a caterpillar is inside a butterfly, and the DNA of a butterfly is inside a caterpillar. They are states of being and states of becoming that are associated with moments, with ontologies. This is something that the creative world deeply understands. It is something that institutions of making deeply understand. It needs to be part of the way we make cities, make legislation, make regions, make businesses. This has a video. Let's see if that works. Yeah. And we need the planet. We do not need concrete and brick. We need plants, species, spaces, well-being, environments that make us feel good. We desperately need to shift our notion of... I'll be quiet while this goes. It is possible for us to make different cities. It's perfectly possible. It's like we tell ourselves that the capital markets are out there and there's this massive power of the market and all we can do is try to adapt to it. We made capital markets. We made economic systems. We can remake them, unmake them, redesign them, recraft them. And the same set of principles needs to come into play. And some of this has to do with ecosystem services. What do we understand about the design principles of nature? Habits and practices, and I'm going to speak to the one, I'm just going to choose one that desperately needs to change, is innovation. Let's start with innovation. We have a habit and a practice around innovation, which is all about inventing stuff, seeing if somebody has a need for it and pushing it out to market to pick up some capital on the assumption that that is the way in which we will achieve change. We will not fast enough, nor holistically enough, nor self-transformatively enough. So we're going to need to change the habit and the practice of innovation in service of self-transformation so that it can become systemic and so that it can become identity-changing. And institutions. We need modular, fragmented. Our institutions are killing us. And I hear people, actually, I had a lovely, interesting conversation, but also a little bit depressing, about the notion of dummy institutions, people with the best of intentions caught in structures that they don't feel they can change, that are channeling their energy into incremental decisions or in poor decisions or in cost-benefit analysis, a whole set of things that we know is totally not fit for purpose. We need a different structure of government, we need a different structure of governance, we need radical, modular, distributed, designed and fit for purpose, for complex and adaptive. And that does mean thinking about what do we understand about the design principles of natural systems and how do we extrapolate from ecosystem services in the natural environment that are inherently abundant and generous and redundant and distributed and translate that into our institutions. Because we need tools and mindsets and institutions that are fit for purpose. Which brings me to capabilities. Again, this is David Snowden-Cynefin framework. I'm sure you know it very well. But one of the things that is so critical in this is that simple question of asking ourselves, are we using tools, ways of working, ways of remunerating, ways of incentivizing, ways of designing that are fit for purpose? Because if we're dealing with complexity, and we are dealing with complexity when you're talking about changing billions of people and their ways of living and their habits of mind and their aspirations to exist, then we need tools and practices that are fit for purpose. culture and creative industries is one of the places where exaptive practices are institutionalized. They are deeply embedded in almost every aspect of what we do until it hits capital markets and gets consolidated into a business that is no longer allowed to become itself or be itself. So let's think about the ways in which we go back to some of those basics and re-embed them in the way we build capability. And ultimately, capability comes to people. This is Mohammed Ridwani. He's the mayor of Leuven, one of the cities that has been working on some of the most advanced aspects of self-transformation and change, also with a strong emphasis on social equity. He deals with, on a daily basis, what every city is dealing with on a daily basis. Post-COVID, it's more virtual than it's physical, but it's still there. It's individuals and collectives coming to the fore with a sense of what they need, what's possible, what they don't get, and what is still missing. If you think about what would we want this to look like, how could we together as a community of practitioners, industries, businesses, designers, artists, change the energy in that from being a protest energy to a maker energy? Because these are the people who will be leading our cities, our businesses, our industries, our corporates, our regional governments, our European governments for the next 40 years. And their energy at the moment is anger and resentment and protest. We have a huge opportunity to change that energy and equip them with the tools to design and make and create and shape difference. And so that just needs a little bit of a Margaret Mead quotation, because really that's what we're talking about. Units, fractals, small committed groups of people making a difference and making possibilities and narratives. And then this is where I come to my past, because I think ultimately it does come down to leadership, but it above all comes down to the shaping of leadership through narrative and story that is very meaningful, very specific, very context specific, and very deliberate in the way in which it constructs future. Through these conversations that I was referring to over summer, there is one thing that emerged. I ran 9 conversations. They were with extremely diverse people, and one thing emerged over and over and over again. We built the world we're living in through magazines, adverts, advertising, film, sales catalogues. Post-Second World War, the technology that ran the Second World War and the First World War, of mass production, of mass engineering, of mass manufacturing, was sublimated into an aspirational life of consumer goods, of appliances, of domestic vision, and it was given to us everywhere, in every conceivable thing. There was a deliberateness and a craft and a consistency of narrative structuring and forming of a sense of identity and of aspirational notion of life that we're still living with. We are in an emergency that requires us to transform ourselves completely and fundamentally, including some of our core cultural identities, and we are not investing anything like the attention, the quality, the skill, and the spread to stories about what to become. I've just told you a story about what we have to stop doing, what a crisis, the things we need. I'm not doing it, we are not doing it. We're not telling ourselves over and over the stories of how we will live, what we aspire to, what to become, what good looks like, what amazing looks like, what sustainable looks like. Those stories are still way too small, still too small, too tiny a voice in what we're doing. These are representations that mobilized 300-400 years of urban planning, of financial allocation, of decision-making about street lines. These are visions, this is Siena, that mobilize thinking about governance of the commons, how to manage public and private value creation over 300-500 years. This one is the most extraordinary. This is 800 years of civic governments changing every 6 months that enacted such a powerful story in the built environment that to create this piazza individual building lines were pulled back by 14 centimetres, deconstructed, pulled down at the owner's cost, and rebuilt with the same visual language and form so that you could create straight lines so that Florence could become Rome, the new Rome. And that sustained a vision of urban redesign, urban planning, and civic law, and dress, and all sorts of things that constructed, in the end, actually the Italian language that is produced modern Italian, and a number of other things. I get excited, so I will stop. But there's something here about how is it possible? We know how to do this. We know how to construct visions over decades, over centuries, and hold them and pursue them. We need that now. We really, really need that now. So my kind of conclusion would be systems respond to attractors. The attractors that we need are acts of imagination. They're acts of imagination that help us change mindsets, shift the way in which we think of ourselves, deeply restructure our habits and our practices, change our institutions and redesign them, build the capabilities we need for a complex world, for a world of constant change, of unintended consequences. Again, one of the things I've just literally heard coming from New York is we probably will build a net zero future. It will be one of the most unjust worlds we've ever built, and it won't be worth having. If we know that now, how would we change it? How would you change the capabilities, the mindsets, the habits, the practices, and the institutions to make that not true? And we need something that is deeply collaborative and deeply collective. So I'm going to close with two things. My favorite reminder of the non-linear nature of human ingenuity. This is a picture from a film with George Clooney in it, for those of you who appreciate George Clooney. It's Tomorrowland. It has the parable of the two wolves at the heart of it, which is the story of there are two wolves inside us. They are always fighting. One is despair, one is hope. And the parable right through this whole film, and the core of the film is, which one wins? The one you feed. And the entire film is about a world that feeds itself narratives of destruction and despair to the point where that justifies the destruction and despair of the world. There is something about how you flip around the other side. What are the incredibly powerful, irresistible, self-fulfilling, self-reinforcing narratives of hope that we so desperately need. And we do have somebody who, at a moment in time, looking at the need to reconstruct, reflected on exactly the same thing. Creative efforts that are proportionate to the dangers that threaten the world we are in. I would love to see a partnership between what is happening in Europe in the context of missions, in the Green Deal, in the broader global context, transacting at the moment. I'm in the midst of agreeing relationships between the west coast of the US and the European missions. How do you take the state of California onto a mission-led logic for urban transformation? The state of California is where some of the biggest film machinery is in the world. Why aren't we thinking about that also here? Let's think about the ways in which we can collectively produce this. Thank you.